Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Towards a canonical translation of the Quran. So this was the presentation that I gave just last week at the American Academy of Religion. And as I told them, it is something which sort of spins off from work that I'm doing in GloQur. So as we go through, I'll touch on how it connects to what I'm looking at during my time at GloQur. But naturally, of course, translation is the general connection. It also spins off from some things that I wrote about in my thesis, which I'm going to show you a bit of. But my thesis was about meaning and tafsir rather than about translation. So although the fact that I had to write the thesis in English, happily to be honest, writing it in English, meant that I was already engaging in some aspect of translation, which then made the connections obvious. So in the opening slides, there's going to be a lot of plain statements like this. It's going to be a series of statements which some of them might be uncontroversial, some of them might require some more explanation or justification. And that will depend on who I'm speaking to at any time. So if you want me to elaborate on anything, I can. Otherwise, I'm going to just try and progress through these statements fairly quickly so that I can get to the more practical side of what I'm talking about. Translation is produced via meaning. Okay, so it seems a strange thing to bring up, but it's very common that that people, when talking about Quran translation in particular, Muslims talk about Quran translation in particular, would often say things like the translation of the meanings of the Quran, because somehow it's become a thing that there is another kind of translation that is not via meaning. But very important to what I'm saying is that first one has to understand a meaning, at least one meaning from the text, and then one renders that into words in the target language. The Arabic tafsir works catalog multiple interpretations of meaning. So under any verse, maybe under each word of a verse, there could be multiple interpretations which are then expressed probably in the same language. So expressed in Arabic, or if the tafsir is done into another language, then already some aspect of translation is probably happening. Many meanings considered valid in tafsir are neglected in existing (brackets English) translations. This is not limited to English, but just my field of examination is English translations, and this is the part. This is part of what I am looking at in my current research. I'm looking at how the existing opinions in tafsir, interpretations or readings, or if you like, potential translations which are available in tafsir works, how they map onto existing translations. So what I often find is that existing translations are distributed across the multiple possible meanings. So under a particular verse, there might be meaning A, meaning B, meaning C. And then when I look at the translations, I can find some of them went with A, some with B, and some with C. But what's interesting is that sometimes I find that none of them touch C at all, or that none of them touch B or C, and they all congregated around A. And that could be for good reasons, but once you look at an aggregated whole of the corpus of translations, it becomes interesting to see how certain things get neglected. So that's where I have this heading from, the untranslated Quran. I'm also poking here at another trope out there, which is the untranslatable Quran, right? I do believe that there's much of the Quran that is untranslated. If we mean by that meanings that are actually in the Quran or have been observed by readers and exegetes of the Quran. So they are in the Quran, according to them at least. And those things, if they haven't been translated, are untranslated Quran, right? So although every verse has been translated, not every meaning of every verse has been rendered into a target language. Where does this diversity occur? At various levels, including obviously the meaning of words, the grammar, you know, the constructs and syntax, and there's all sorts of ways that diversity happens in interpretation and therefore in translation. But one of those levels, which is the one that I'm looking at here, is even in terms of the skeletal text, how it is to be read and vocalized, and therefore what words are present in order to be interpreted and translated. So that is where we get the connection to the canonical readings. Okay, so if a single word could be read either فَتَبَيَّنُوا or as فَتَثَبَّتُوا, right, and both fit the same skeletal text, then they are two different words. They are two different words which may have different translations. That's not to say that they're not complementary or they're contradictory. That's a separate point. All that I'm focused on here, they are different words, and those words may have different translations. I've said here authoritative readings or qira'at provide meanings which are also neglected, right? So that's just to follow on really the point that I've made of the untranslated Qur'an. The qira'at contain a lot of data which is untranslated Qur'an. So to elaborate on this point, we have what are known as the 10 Canonical Readings. My purpose is not to go into the history of these readings or why they're canonical or what should we think about readings that are not canonical. Those are, of course, extensive discussions that are possible elsewhere. I'm really trying to take this on a practical level that one way or another, this is where we are in terms of the position of Islamic scholarship. Today, there isn't really much to any dissent around these questions, at least in theory. As in terms of practice, we'll come to the next slide. So there are 10 compilations of choices which are made at specific junctures. So under not every verse, but plenty of verses, there are individual words which there are divergent readings of. And then certain readers have made choices which then are compiled across the whole Quran, and that is what we are calling a reading. So the 10 qira'at or 10 compilations of choices, and these are attributed to 10 readers scattered along several regions. Okay, each of these 10 readings, however, has two sub-narrations that have also been canonized, have also reached the level where they are the official two readings of each, official two sub-readings of each reading. So for example, from the reading of Asim, we have Hafs and Shu'bah. From the reading of Nafi' of Medina, we have the readings of the sub-readings of Warsh and Qalun. Okay, the terminology is still sort of in development. Okay, so this is the way I talk about the sub-narrations or sub-readings. Asim, of course, is a Kufan reading. So Hafs and Asim is a Kufan Iraqi reading, which is interesting because we don't tend to think of it that way in regional terms when it becomes normative, as I'm going to talk about. Hafs from Asim happens to be dominant in most of the world today. So a couple of caveat terms in there. Most of the world, because there are several regions or countries where other readings have more prominence. And today, because that has not always held in all of history, there were times when other readings were more prominent. But the exact history of that and how Hafs and Asim came to be dominant still requires a fair amount of research to try to determine precisely what happened. Yes, sometimes it's attributed to being spread by the Ottoman Empire. That definitely seems to be a factor. Subsequent to that, of course, printing and then the production of the Cairo edition have cemented the dominance of Hafs and Asim. They've certainly cemented the normativity of it. Now, when it comes to the differences between these readings, most of them are just matters of pronunciation, but a minority do go beyond that and affect meaning and translation. Islamic scholarship, and here I'm speaking very broad terms. You could say usuli scholarship. You could talk about the qira'ah scholarship, tafsir scholarship, however it may be, affirms the Quranicity, slightly made up word, but I didn't make it up myself, the Quranicity of all 10 readings without privileging any. So the official or theoretical position is that all of these 10 readings, including Asim, including Nafi', including Ibn Kathir, al-Makki, whatever, they are to be considered Qur'an. And what is beyond the 10, basically, is not Qur'an. It may still be useful, may still be analyzed in terms of tafsir or language or anything else, but it's not Qur'an. But the point is that between the 10, there is no sense that one of them is more Qur'an than the others. They are equally accepted and canonized. So now we come to Hafsonormativity, which has become a bit of a a hashtag now on Twitter. We've been talking about it. Hafsonormativity is a word to capture something of the situation that we find ourselves in the current time. Statements made about the Qur'an, such as the Qur'an says, and then we quote the verse, are often statements about the reading of Hafs and do not necessarily apply to other readings. Even word counts. How many times does this word appear in the Qur'an? The answer is often given according to Hafs without any regard for how that is affected by different readings. Some words exist in other readings that don't even exist in Hafs. Right? So if you count, how many times does the word فَتَثَبَّتُوا come in the Quran? Well, if we're just looking at Hafs, then 0, right? So oftentimes what's described about the Quran is actually a description of Hafs and needs some adjustment if the readings are to be taken into account. Even the idea of every rih in the Quran is for punishment and every riyah is for mercy, right? These kind of things actually is not even correct according to Hafs, but it is even less correct when other readings are taken into account. Just the fact of multiplicity is the issue here, because if in a single verse, some of them read rih and some of them read riyah, then you can't really make a single statement about what they are to mean. Awareness of multiplicity is mainly confined to specialists, particularly the qira'at, the reciters who might study these through didactic poems like the Shatibiya and the Durra and Tayyibatul Nashr. They are very, constantly thinking about the differences between readings. But for most people, of course, that is not an everyday concern. And arguably, and this might need to be established through data, arguably for most people, for most Muslims, there's not even an awareness of the existence of multiple readings because certain statements have become widely accepted. Sort of simplifications have been accepted as basic fact, such as when some preachers say, you can travel to the furthest east and the furthest west and you will not find one single letter different in this Quran, not one single vowel which is different in this Quran, even though that just contradicts the basics of Islamic scholarship, which affirms differences between letters, all of which are considered acceptable when they are within the scope of the 10 canonical readings. Generally, there is no argument made at all for Hafs being superior to the other readings, whether being more authentic or being better in terms of its meaning and therefore better to be translated or tafsired, right? I see no serious argument, partly to indicate that there might be some non-serious arguments, which I don't want to get into now, but there are some people who have argued, who are trying to argue nowadays, not historically, but a modern argument, that the reading of Hafs basically represents what was the reading of the masses throughout Islamic history and is the authoritative reading. So I don't want to go into that argument. It doesn't really deserve much attention, but insofar as it does, it would have to be a more direct discussion. The quote that I put here is something I added to the presentation after when I was preparing a GloQur thread about Ahmed Zaki Hamad's translation. I noticed that he did make a statement here about why he based his translation on Hafs. The simple justification that could be provided would just simply be, well, most people are reading that nowadays, and that's the one that I am used to, and so that's what I will translate. That's not a terrible justification. But what's interesting is his justification went far beyond that and came close to the argument that I'm saying is non-serious. He said that the source text has depended upon the Mus'haf al-Madina, which is the King Fahd complex edition, in accordance with the transmission of the Quran by Hafs from Asim, as conveyed by the third Caliph of Islam. Now it sounds like he's saying that Hafs and Asim in particular is the reading from Uthman. It sounds like that's what he's saying. This is, and then naming Uthman is important because he is the one who's responsible for the canonizing of the Quranic text. This is the authenticated, undisputed, normative recitation. He even used the word normative just to make me happy. As the Prophet ﷺ read it publicly, had it transcribed and taught it personally to thousands of his followers. Now this here, does this mean the reading of Hafs in particular? It sounds a lot like that's what he's saying. it might be possible to read his text in another way. I did make some suggestions, and I spoke about it on Twitter, and I made some suggestions of how it might alternatively be read. But the point is that he basically allowed the readers, I think, to understand that the reading of Hafs is the one that the Prophet read publicly and taught personally, as opposed to any other reading, which he does not mention here. Hafs is frequently in the minority. So this is the fourth point here. There are 28 words, 47 junctures, as far as what I've traced so far, based on some other works that have been done. That there are this many places where you would find that Hafs is alone in reading a particular word. For example, a famous verse in Surah Al-Rum, إِنَّ فِي ذَلِكَ لَآيَاتٍ لِلْعَالَمِينَ. All of the 10 readers, including Shu'bah from Asim, read لِلْعَالَمِينَ. And Hafs reads it لِلْعَالِمِينَ. لِلْعَالِمِينَ. So in this kind of situation, if I am to translate, for example, this verse as for those who know, as opposed to for the worlds, if I translate it لِلْعَالِمِينَ, I should recognize that I'm translating the minority among the qurra, not the minority among those who are reciting the verse in the world today. So it's a different kind of minority, but I think it's one that should be kept in mind from a critical perspective. Why is one reading so alone in that? Especially if an argument is attempted to be made for the superiority of this reading over others. Of course, Hafs is not alone in having tafarrudat or lone junctures or being in the minority. That's nothing special about Hafs either. I'm just saying that in order to counter the view that Hafs is the majority, Hafs is the majority, right? And the last point I've already touched on about translations. So there are exceptions of being Hafs alone. There is at least one translation in English of the reading of Nafi', which is the Bewley translation. And they have their reasoning for choosing Nafi', right? That's part of their project, their Medinan project, where everything is about Medina and Imam Malik and the Maliki school and Andalusia. And so as part of that project that the Bewleys are part of, they wanted to translate according to the reading of Nafi', the Imam of Medina, right? Could have, and this is also the reading that Imam Malik himself expressed a preference for, right? But for the most part, they stick to Hafs alone. And there are some junctures where a particular translator might depart from the reading of Hafs and maybe adopt another. Even someone like Yusuf Ali has been known to do that. Tafsir and Tawjih. So I want to talk about the attitudes in the tafsir works. And I'm going to do that partly in a practical way by showing you a couple of tables that I drew up in my thesis. Tafsir works, at least the detailed ones, engage with multiple readings. Some of the tafsirs go back before the time when the readings were canonized. So At-Tabari, and I'm going to talk about Tabari in a bit of detail, is the sheikh, the teacher of Ibn Mujahid, who is Musabbi' as-Sab'a. He's the sevenizer of the seven. This has become a word now as well, sevenization. So the 7 readings then later became the 10 readings, because 3 which remained in circulation were then added by Ibn al-Jazari. But often we talk about the 7 readings. So the tafsirs which preceded that would not have had a concept in them of the 7, right? Ones which came after tended to work with the 7 or the 10 or the 7 plus 1 or 2, whatever it may be. Another point here is that oftentimes the Mufassir is speaking about the Quran primarily not based on Hafs. And At-Tabari is an interesting case of this because he seems to be basically unaware of Hafs. Whenever Hafs is alone in something, At-Tabari seems to ignore it, right? And that's something I'm going to elaborate a bit on in a separate study as well. But what's interesting is that we have this problem where tafsirs are printed nowadays, and when people are printing it, the publishers will just stick in Hafs reading under every verse. And that may contradict what the Mufassir is actually doing and what he's intending, what he's referring to. Even in modern times, Ibn Ashur, for example, his starting point or his base reading, as I'm calling it, is Qalun. Is Qalun and Nafi'. He's reading according to Nafi'. He's Tunisian. There's no reason why Hafs would be central to his way of discussing. He starts off with, okay, this is the position of the reading of Nafi', or this is the Jumhur, and then he would talk about the reading of Hafs. He won't overlook it, but he won't center it in his discussion. So I'm going to look at Tabari in a moment. I'm pointing out here that there's an adjacent understudy genre. The pile of books here you see is, on the right, this is a pile of just what I happen to have in print, works of Tawjih al-Qira'at, or some related genres as well. Ma'ani al-Qur'an is included here. But for the most part, these are Tawjih al-Qira'at works, classical ones. And then on the left is a pile of modern ones, which use those earlier materials, but also have some quite novel approaches. And I'm going to speak about the emergence in the current time of a more pluralistic approach compared to what was done early on. So where am I getting this statement about a canonical translation? Canonical edition is the starting point of that. If you remember from this earlier slide, there's this picture of a mushaf at the top, and at the side of it there are variants listed. This is maybe for the 7 rather than the 10, I'm not sure. But the basic idea is here. You can print, and these things exist, a mushaf which includes all the variants within the canonical readings. So we could call that a canonical edition, right? It's a bit different from what is sometimes talked about, a critical edition, where people are talking about gathering the variants which exist in manuscripts and trying to decide based on editing principles what is the most authentic reading of the text, or the most authentic version of the consonantal text, whatever it may be. In terms of Islamic scholarship and the idea of critical edition, to a reasonable extent, I think an argument can be made that the work of the Mufassirin and the Qurra and this whole process of studying the readings is actually very similar to the work of establishing a critical edition. But what's different about it is that there is also an inherent recognition of the validity of multiplicity, or if you want to, you could see it a little bit like ambiguity, which is to say they were not all setting out to say, this is the one correct reading. They were sometimes arguing for what is the best reading, but they weren't saying always that the other ones are wrong. However, sometimes they did say that the other ones were wrong. And At-Tabari in particular is, again, a good case study of that, because in his time, there was nothing surprising for him to say about certain readings. This reading is unacceptable. It doesn't work in the Arabic language. But then later on, that one becomes one which is accepted and canonized and is present in the 10. A canonical translation, which is what I'm advocating in this paper, would draw and should draw from all of this detailed literature, right? Because it shouldn't start off from the imagination that no one has thought about the meanings or made arguments about the meanings before, right? And I say that because I'm going to show you a project where this was not adhered to. Right, before we do that, let's take a detour from the slides to look at this table, and let me know if there's anything not displaying in terms of size and so on. These are actually two tables, right? But what I've done for the first time, just for you, is put them side by side to make it a bit easier to navigate. But we're going to look at the tables one by one. So first we'll look on the left. This is where I was documenting with some examples from Surah Al-An'am, which was the case study I took in my thesis study. I was just noting what was At-Tabari's attitude to the variants. What you can see here already is that I've provided alternative translations for the two readings, right? So I selected examples where an alternative translation could indeed come up. So ثم ما كانت فتنتهم إلا أن قالوا والله ربنا ما كنا مشركين. So والله ربنا versus the other reading والله ربنا. I'm not writing here who are the readers who did each one, etc. It's not the point. So I'm also translating according to what At-Tabari understands the difference to be. By Allah, our Lord, by Allah, O our Lord, we were not mushrikeen. So when discussing the two meanings, At-Tabari expresses a preference for the second one, which is not Hafs. Always what I've done here, the first one mentioned is Hafs. This is a part of Hafsonormativity. I'm part of the system. I cannot entirely escape it. Partly I'm working within the system. So that means the first one I list is always including Hafs. Not exclusively Hafs, but including Hafs. And the second one is the one that is not Hafs. So Wallahi Rabbana, he prefers, because it is more appropriate as a response. It just fits in terms of meaning better. He doesn't say it's more authentic in its isnad or anything like that. Secondly, وَلِتَسْتَبِينَ سَبِيلُ الْمُجْرِمِينَ. This is the reading of Hafs and others, so that the way of the criminals may become clear. وَلِتَسْتَبِينَ سَبِيلُ الْمُجْرِمِينَ. So there, sabil is the fa'il of tastabin. Okay, but another reading, وَلِتَسْتَبِينَ سَبِيلَ الْمُجْرِمِينَ. Now that changes the grammatical structure, because now tastabina, the fa'il has to be anta, so that you, O Prophet, will recognize. So the word tastabina then has to have a slightly different meaning. And then the object of that verb is sabila, so that you will recognize clearly the way of the criminals. So in a way, you can already see, like before getting into it, you can see the value of the idea of translating the qira'at separately. Even though what I'm focusing on here is what is the attitude of an early exegete towards them. Here, prefers the standard reading. Look at the Hafsonormativity here. I've called it the standard reading. I don't agree with that description really, but that's what I wrote as part of the points I was making. So he prefers this reading because its meaning is broader, right? So not just that you, Prophet, will recognize, but that everyone will recognize. It will become clear. So because it gives a broader meaning, he prefers that meaning. لأبيه آزر إذ قال إبراهيم لأبيه آزر. He said to his father, Azar, okay, to his father Azar. لأبيه آزر. This has to be understood as munada. Abraham said to his father, O Azar, and I put in the O just to make that clearer that it is vocative. He prefers the first because it is the majority reading. So here there is a sense in which he's saying the qurra, the readers, most of them say li abihi azara, only a few have gone with li abihi azaru. So I'm going to give preference for that reason. That's another reason that he might prefer. نرفع درجات من نشاء. نرفع درجات من نشاء. So we raise in ranks whomever we will. So man nasha is the object of narfa'u. Here, darajati is the object of narfa'u. Narfa'u, we raise the ranks of. So there's idafa between darajati and man nasha. So the translation then, it's not radically different, but it actually is different in translation and it is a different meaning. At-Tabari says both are acceptable, they amount to the same. No big deal. Doesn't see the need to choose here. وَجَعَلَ اللَّيْلَ سَكَنًا وَجَاعِلُ اللَّيْلِ سَكَنًا. Made the night a repose and maker of the night as a repose. He says they're equally acceptable and equivalent in meaning. They're just different grammatical ways of getting to the same meaning. لَا يُضِلُّونَ بِأَهْوَائِهِمْ لَا يَضِلُّونَ بِأَهْوَائِهِمْ. Going from the form 4 of adalla to the form 1 of dalla, they mislead through their desires. They go astray because of their desires. At-Tabari prefers the first because of the context. إِنَّ الَّذِينَ فَرَّقُوا دِينَهُمْ وَكَانُوا شِيَعًا. إِنَّ الَّذِينَ فَارَقُوا دِينَهُمْ. Those who divided their religion, those who left their religion. That's variant translations here. At-Tabari says he prefers the first, but they amount to the same meaning. So let's go into that now a little bit more deeply. And here's where I started fleshing out some theory around how to approach the qira'at. So in my thesis, I talked about reduction versus plurality. And I'm going to give you a slightly different schema in the next slide, a more elaborate one. But at this point, I'm talking about tafsir. In reduction, I'm trying to say, can these be made to amount to the same thing? Not necessarily about translation, but can we basically say that they mean the same thing? Or the two translations can mean the same thing. So here I had to comb through the works of Tawjih, and then I would try to find some way that someone has argued that they can mean the same thing. So here, Wallahi Rabbina, Wallahi Rabbana, there is a view that Rabbana here is not vocative, but rather it's an accusative of praise. If so, it can mean the same as the first reading. Okay. But what if you wanted to distinguish them? What if that was your thing? And this is what's happened really in very recent works, in like what I was talking about in the contemporary works. There's a lot more attempt. And in the Bridges translation, I'm going to show you, there's a direct attempt to try to find the differences between them, to try to emphasize the differences between them rather than make them the same. Not to create contradiction, but to create complementarity of meaning and diversity of meaning. So how could it be? The two expressions describe the same moment in two ways. The first suggests that the mushriks felt solidarity with each other, and the second emphasizes their desperation for God. These are explanations which I took from some works. I'm not necessarily saying they're great explanations. If I put it in square brackets, that's because I didn't even find someone made a point about it, but I inserted something possible from myself. وَلِتَسْتَبِينَ سَبِيلُ الْمُجْرِمِينَ and سَبِيلَ الْمُجْرِمِينَ, the first encompasses the second. So a bit like what At-Tabari has already argued. There's an idea about plurality. Lihabi, Azara and Azaru is a great example of where you really can't make them boil down to the same thing. Right? Because either Ibrahim is calling his father, or the one who's named as his father here, as Azar, or he's not doing so on that occasion. But the word Azar is just part of the description of what he was doing. So his father was named Azar. He addressed him by this name. That's two separate points. They can't be made to amount to the same thing in the verse. Whoever is raised, so are his degrees, or that they are separate concepts. I made a little bit of argument for it there, potentially. Okay. وَجَعَلَ اللَّيْلَ سَكَنًا, they really are very easy to reconcile. لَا يُضِلُّونَ and لَا يَضِلُّونَ. Someone who leads others astray is necessarily astray already. So this is a way of bringing them together in one meaning. But they can be also seen as two separate points. فَرَّقُوا and فَارَقُوا, there is an argument that both of them mean the same thing, namely to split. And then this is how to see it as a separate. So this was an earlier iteration of the theory around it. And as I say, I was not focused at that point on questions of translation. Now I want to look at it in terms of translation. So there are four potential strategies. And to some extent, these exist out there in the world. So let's start with the normative strategy. Normative strategy is to say, I will treat one of the readings as the reading, and I will just translate that. So that's what most of them do for Hafs. In the case of the Bewleys, they did that for Nafi'. That might be something you choose to do if a reading is dominant in a particular area, in a particular region. So you would translate the Quran according to what they are used to. That would be one reason you might do that. Another way, if we go across, is critical. The critical practice would be like what the early exegetes were doing, what At-Tabari was doing. Each time you come to a variant, you make a decision. I think this is the preferred reading. This is the sounder reading. Or this is just the more useful reading for translation. Somehow it is better to be translated, so I will choose that one instead. As I mentioned, I noticed that Yusuf Ali did this in at least one place where he, instead of translating qala, he translated that as qul, and then he said that there is some other reading, but he used a sort of strange vocabulary to describe what he was doing. But I can show you that example a bit later if you like. But what happened is that he really just used another qira'at because he just felt that he couldn't translate it according to hafs in that place. The inclusive approach is to try to come up with one translation of each verse, which is inclusive of the varieties of recitation, the varieties of reading. So that may mean that you find one way of reading the two readings. So for example, you've got reading A, reading B. And reading A has got two possible ways to understand it. Reading B has also got two possible ways to understand it. And it so happens that one of these two and one of these two match. So that's what I call an overlapping interpretation. An inclusive approach could be to translate this overlapping interpretation. Like what I said about Wallahi Rabbina, if Rabbina is taken to be Rabbana is taken to be an accusative of praise instead of a vocative. So to select the overlapping interpretation is one of the inclusive approaches. Another thing that you might do is to say, well, in English, I can, or whatever language, I can actually come up with a phrase that is ambiguous enough that it incorporates the variant readings that I'm trying to translate. So the inclusive approach would match with a principle that some of the scholars have expressed out loud, where they say al-aslu at-tawafuq fil ma'na, which is to say that between the readings, the default is to assume that they agree in meaning, right? The modern approach, or a particular modernist approach, if we're going to say it like that, emphasizes the difference between them. But earlier on, they were mostly trying to say, yeah, as far as possible, we just see the readings as meaning the same thing. We're not trying to generate multiple meanings. So now we come to the pluralist, whatever we call it, pluralist approach, which is going to be exemplified by the Bridges translation. And there are some other modern works which follow the same. In my thesis, I talked about the Gazan master's thesis project, where they did Tafsir and Qur'an according to the 10 readings. And a lot of that is very strained. I didn't want to be too hard on the person because a master's student who's done their dissertation, but then it got published as a book and is, put out into the sea, doesn't go through further peer review, but a lot of the points are very strained and really not clear at all. But this reflects a modern conception where the point is to actually have as much variation as possible to highlight something about the desired multiplicity in the Quran. So there we come to the Bridges translation. One of the better things to happen in 2020. So before this point, there was no translation that attempted to capture the multiplicity of qira'at. Now this is here. I have to tell you that originally when I got accepted for my PhD, my proposal was actually about this. My proposal was the impact of the canonical readings upon translation of the Quran. However, my supervisor was not sympathetic to this topic, and I just felt like it would be better to shift gear and postpone this to a later time, which is kind of what I've done. So otherwise, I would have perhaps been the first one to do something in it, but someone got there first because I was working on something which, inshallah, something which was better for me. This project was done by Fadl Suleiman. He's from Egypt. He's spent time in the USA. He's based now in London. I should tell you also, he is a good friend of mine. I respect him a lot. I'm going to say some very critical things about this piece of work, but it's about the piece of work and not about the person, of course. I should also say that I am listed in this translation as one of the linguistic consultants. So all the disclaimers here. I'm listed there because I was consulted on some linguistic questions. However, I was not consulted about the qira'at. And in fact, I had a conversation with Ustad Fadl about the qira'at, and I pleaded with him to pay more attention to methodology. And my pleas fell on deaf ears, I'm afraid to say. This project, as I spoke about in my GloQur thread, is primarily for another purpose, which is promoting reflection on the Quran. There's a foreignizing approach which is applied in this translation, where deliberately things which are very particular to the Arabic language, things to do with pronouns and plurals and singulars and tenses, are retained as literally as possible in the English translation in order to prompt reflection on part of the reader, in order to be surprising and jarring. Things about the future are spoken about in the past tense in the Quran that's not strange to a Quranic reader, but normally translators end up, وَسِيقَ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا is Fadl's one of his favorite examples. And those who disbelieved were driven, literally, وَسِيقَ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا إِلَى جَهَنَّمَ زُمَرًا. It's were driven, literally speaking, but translators don't go with that. And by the way, Fadl told me, he told me that he presented this point to Professor Abdul Halim, my supervisor. And Professor Abdul Halim, according to Fadl, eventually said that he'll consider this for a future edition. And when Fadl told me that, I said, it's impossible. No, I don't think that Professor Abdul Halim would ever consider something so foreignizing, because Abdul Halim is all about nativizing. He's all about avoiding what he calls Arabic English. There's no way that he will write that they were driven. No way. So I asked him about that. He said, no, I just said that to get him to change the subject. So I was reassured that Professor Abdul Halim would not consider it. But this is the kind of main approach in this translation. It was not originally all about the qira'at, but that became something that was attached onto the project and then has become on the front cover of the project and what people will see as the main purpose of the project. However, I happen to know that that is not the case, but it's presented that way now. So the final product is called the Bridges translation of the 10 qira'at of the Noble Quran. They take a highly pluralistic conception. Hopefully you've got an idea what I mean by that now. Of reading diversity, they take a very apologetic approach. I'm not necessarily against apologetic approaches. I'm just saying it should be clearly noted that that's what they do in their introduction. They consider the multiplicity of qira'at to be a miracle. Again, there might be some examples where that that could be somewhat, an argument that can be made, but there are many cases where I think that really cannot be made. It is, to me, qira'at for the most part is a scholarly category, and I wouldn't talk about the miracle of nasikh and mansukh, for example. To me, it's not much different to say miracle of qira'at, miracle of nasikh and mansukh, right? It's sort of conflating the essential nature of the Quran and its miracle with things that are actually part of scholarly attempt to analyze the text. Anyway, the introduction itself conflates between ahruf, which I haven't talked about today, and qira'at and dialects. It makes them all the same thing. It shows no awareness of the scholarly tradition. It has no references to any contemporary works or classical works. There is a bibliography for the translation as such. It does list some tafsirs. It does not list any tawjih works. I'm not sure if they are aware that there is a genre called tawjih al-qira'at, which is disturbing for a work that came out of this on this particular topic. What happens in this translation is that Hafs is in the main body along with the Arabic text. So normativity is maintained in that respect. Variants are put in the footnote, but without the Arabic text. So this is a very frustrating thing for someone who's actually interested in qira'at, because you cannot read the qira'at. You can only read their interpretation into English of what the qira'at were. You cannot read what the variant was. You have to go to another work for that, which is a shame, because it would have been very easy to just write the Arabic word in the footnote as well. There are plenty of linguistic errors in this work, and that is clearly due to them not referring to the tafsirs, even though they may have done so at certain points. At other places, they clearly did not. There are certain verses where clearly they did not look at a tafsir, and they could have avoided those things. Instead, it seems that the translator has often just looked at it, made an assumption about the meaning, and written down. I can give you more figures later on. I'm currently analyzing what they've written in Surah Al-An'am. I can give you how many mistakes and what they are, and you can see. But I'm going to give you a few quick examples at the end of this. Sometimes the Arabic distinctions, because they want distinctions, are quite forced or quite strained. So what's the difference between najja and anja? Yeah, to save, to rescue, to deliver, right? Najja is the form 2 version of that. Anja is the form 4 version of that. But both of them is to make someone saved, to enact najat on someone, right? Is there a difference between najja and anja? Arabic scholars are not in agreement about that. A case could be made, an argument could be made that there's a difference, but basically both of them are just ways of making naja transitive. So you make it transitive through the shadda, or you make it transitive through the hamza. Two different ways, form 2, form 4. But in this translation, they want to really say najja means deliver, and anja means save. I can't remember if it's that way around. Now, the problem is also, is there a difference in deliver and save in English? Are we so clear about that? So it comes across as quite arbitrary in some of these cases. My strategy, what I'm advocating, is actually to combine the inclusive and the pluralist, right? So if you remember in terms of this diagram, it's the bottom two things. Because I think choosing one of these over the other would be committing too much to one conception of the qira'at. I am talking about providing distinct translations whenever a distinction comes up, and wherever possible, also a combined translation. So you've seen that already when I've talked about reduction versus plurality. In this, I'm sitting on the fence regarding whether qira'at are something to do with indeterminacy in the meanings or in the text itself, versus an intended diversity, that God revealed it with this multiplicity built in. Because I think that an argument can certainly be made for this pluralistic thesis. It's just not always persuasive. It's not always persuasive that, wow, this is really amazing. There are two different versions of this word, but also they happen to mean the same thing, or I have to force a difference between them in order to justify why God revealed two different words. To me, it seems better to sit on the fence for the time being and allow people also to draw different types of conclusions. As I say, a combined translation is not always possible. Sometimes the meanings are irreducible. Azar, the O Azar example. See, I don't think you can translate it in one way that captures both those readings. That doesn't mean they're contradictory, it just means they're irreducible to one translation. So I'm just going to give you 4 examples, and then I'll conclude, then I'll stop. So the first example is from the start of the Quran. It's the first one that comes up, Maliki Yawmiddin versus Maliki Yawmiddin. Here, Malik means owner, Malik means king. Okay. Can they be combined into one thing? Well, not really. I don't think so. But the reason is that if you look in the Tawjih work, some of them will say every Malik is a Malik, but not the opposite. And some of them say every Malik is a Malik, but not the opposite. So they disagree on how much one might encompass the other or include the other. There's different views about it. In the end, Malik is basically one who owns, because of ismu fa'il from Malaka. And Malik is one who has authority and dominion, sovereignty. So as a suggestion, as a combined translation, one way you can do that is sort of to smush the two words together, not a technical term, of course. So you could say sovereign master. Sovereign master would be encompassing of the two. It's one way that it could be done. I put at the bottom what the Bridges put. This example is fine. Some of the others are not. You'll see in a moment. In Surah Al-Baqarah, فَتَلَقَّى آدَمُ مِنْ رَبِّهِ كَلِمَاتٍ. Most of the readers have this. Ibn Kathir, not to be confused with the exegete, of course. This is the reader, Ibn Kathir al-Makki, has فَتَلَقَّى آدَمَ مِنْ رَبِّهِ كَلِمَاتٌ. So if you were committed to talaqqa, meaning received, you're going to get what happened to Bridges. And interestingly, they put this example in their introduction, which means that they were a bit proud of it. But this is a travesty. Bridges have written Adam received words, most of the majority, and the other reading, Adam was received by words. Now, what on earth would that mean? The first thing I would do if I thought that that's what it means is I would look to the tafsirs to try to say, please someone explain to me, what does it mean to be received by words? How do words receive somebody? What does that mean? I would not write it down and just publish it in a book as if, that's going to be understood. Again, they want people to do tadabbur on it, but this is not tadabbur, it's, maybe guiding people into confusion, right? What does it mean to be received by words? That's not what the people who recited this understood by it. That's not what Ibn Kathir al-Makki understood by it when he recited فَتَلَقَّى آدَمَ مِنْ رَبِّهِ كَلِمَاتٌ. All you have to do is look at the Tafsir and Tawjih works, you'll see the explanation. They say that the word talaqqa means basically from laqiya, is for things to meet. So it is for Adam to encounter, and here I'm in the combined translation, I'm sort of forcing that. I don't think it's necessary, but encountered words from his Lord, right? And that can indeed end up being translated as received. That's perfectly fine. فَتَلَقَّى آدَمَ مِنْ رَبِّهِ كَلِمَاتٌ means exactly the same thing. It's just expressed in a different way. But there isn't a different meaning here, whereby they thought that the words received Adam, because that's incoherent. One example for An'am we talked about, so I'll just skim over it. There is a possibility that Wallahi Rabbana can be read in terms of the other one. So this then would be the combined reading. Wallahi Rabbina translation can be the translation for both of them. Okay. And finally, one from Surah An-Naml. Allah yasjudu. This is in the words of the hoopoe, the hudhud bird. He is complaining about what the people of Saba, of Sheba, are up to, and Satan has misled them. Allah yasjudu lillah, such that they do not prostrate to God. The other reading, which is here from 3 of the readers, or you could say 2.5, so 2 of the main readers and then one narration from Yaqub, is Ala yasjudu lillah. Ala yasjudu lillah. Now, this is a bit tricky to understand, and this is the way that it's been explained in Tafsir and Tawjih works. They say, this breaks down to Ala ya usjudu lillah. Ala ya usjudu. So although it's written all as one word in the canonical, in the orthography of the text, it is to be understood in the way that I put in brackets here, ya usjudu. So the ala is a tanbih, hey everyone, or hey, and the ya is like calling out to everyone. So in a sense, it could be seen as reinforcing the tanbih already achieved by ala. Okay, I'm just giving you a summary of what they talk about in the Tawjih works. So there's a difference of opinion. Is it nida and then the munada is mahdhuf, or is it tanbih and ta'keed tanbih, right? But both of them amount to the same thing. Ala ya usjudu. So then either it's a continuation of what the hudhud is saying, or it is now diverted onto what God is saying, and he's telling everyone now to prostrate to God. So here's a way that you could translate it. I think this might be the first time it's been done. Listen, everyone, prostrate to God. Right? So this is a translation based on that. I cannot see how these two can be combined into a single translation, right? Which is why I cannot commit to the inclusive strategy. Bridges did this, that they do not prostrate, fine. And how can they not prostrate? That is not based on any tafsir, it's not based on anything. It's based on Egyptian interpretation, I'm sorry to say. Because grammatically, it would have to be ala yasjuduna lillah, ala yasjuduna, don't they? And then it can be disapprovingly, how can they not? But there's no explanation then for why is the noon elliptic, why is the noon removed? Ala yasjuduna lillah, that would be. But in Egypt, that would be okay. Ala yasjudu, you know, ma yasjudu ba'a. So you would leave off the noon. But in classical Arabic, Quranic Arabic, that is not possible. So this is why I'm saying that clearly linguistic errors were based on not reading and surveying the works of tafsir, and that would leave something to be desired. Further reading, there are sections of my thesis that I've referred to, and then the inshallah here is stronger than forthcoming. If I get a chance to to write this book, then you can read more about it in there.